Thank you all so much for coming. And so yes, as he mentioned, I've come to the effective altruism movement out of a background in policy evaluation. So I've worked on randomized controlled trials of several policies, mostly surrounding sort of the expansion of banking and insurance in Africa. And then here at Berkeley, in my PhD in political science, I've been thinking a bit more about the question of, once we have evidence on beneficial policies, how do those get translated, as it were, into action by in particular African governments or the governments of low-income countries more generally? And so specifically, we might say, in terms of policies that drive long-run economic growth, that drive systemic change, what do we know about them? And how can effective altruists contribute to them today? Thank you. And so when I say systemic change, what I mean is a type of long-run economic growth that pulls countries sustainably out of poverty. So, canonical example from recent history, South Korea. In 1965, after the end of the Korean War, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. Their per capita GDP was $79 per year. Do the math, obviously much less than $1 per day. Less than 40 years later, of course, incredible change. And so what I'll be talking about today is what we know about the types of policies that contribute to change like this, and again, how people who are not located in low-income countries can support them. And so South Korea went through exactly the same pattern of economic growth that all high-income countries have gone through, for generally speaking, over a much longer period of time. I mean, in countries like the US, the UK, elsewhere in Europe, this was a question often of hundreds of years to reduce poverty to where we see it today. And so the major question is what can be done to sort of accelerate that process in the way that South Korea has done. And so I'm going to make an argument not just for sort of the standard explanation of the role of good economic policy. Essentially, you need policies that promote the creation of small businesses, that promote job creation, that promote investment. But we know a great deal about what those policies are, what they look like. There's a broader question of why do some governments adopt those policies when others don't? And so the broader question is that this is about both political and economic institutions. And so when I say institutions here, there's both sort of the standard sense of it, as an organization, the World Trade Organization, the UN, something like that. In political science, the term institution actually has a slightly different meaning. And so what it means is the rules of the game, the rules that structure interaction between two or more people. So for example, thinking through our own political history, before we instituted a 2-term limit for presidents, it was nonetheless common for presidents to only stay for 2 terms on the basis of the example set by George Washington. So that was what we would call an informal institution. It wasn't written, but it still existed, and it shaped people's behavior regardless. And so essentially, the rules of the game for who gets to access political power really have a strong role in shaping the types of economic policy that people put in place. So what I'll ask here, what do pirates do? What comes to mind when you think of a pirate? Not the digital kind, the like swashbuckling kind. Yes?
They steal stuff and they fish people off of ships.
Yeah, critically, they steal stuff. Yes. What else do pirates do? Or rather, I should say, what does the IRS do?
Fewer boats. So.
I'm sorry?
I was just joking. There are fewer boats involved.
Yes, there are fewer boats. What else does the IRS do? They collect taxes. How is what the IRS does different to what pirates do?
It's legal.
It's legal. That's part of it. Well, how else? There's a social, Exactly, there's a social contract, there's an expectation you get something in return for your taxes. You're gonna add something?
I was gonna say, like, there's a set of like rules as opposed to it being like just random behavior.
It's rule bound. Yes, exactly. So yeah, you guys have gotten all the main points of this. So thinking about, and you can actually think about in general governments more generally acting in one of these two ways. So think about, for example, kleptocratic dictators in low-income countries, like for example Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of Congo or the former Zaire. You know, in power for 30 years, stole everything he could get his hands on over that time. With really very little concern for whether that made it more difficult for people to then, you know, continue reinvesting in their businesses or what have you over the long run. And we can contrast that to other African countries, for example, like Botswana, where the government has essentially, you know, they've invested in better economic policies. They do collect taxes, but they're lower, they're predictable. They sort of leave people with enough money to keep reinvesting in their businesses. And so, you know, in general, they have better economic policy. And so, the big difference there is in what in political science we end up calling the type of political settlement that these countries have. And so specifically, in countries that lack a stable political settlement, or we should say stable political institutions, where people don't know if they're going to be in power the next day, they have huge incentives to just take what they can and run. Or, as happened in the DR Congo, to take what they can and use it to pay off their enemies, to pay off the people who are trying to get them out of office. Conversely, in a country like Botswana that had the sort of stable rules of the game, where the people who were in power knew that they were going to stay in power for a longer time, that gives them incentives to basically adopt more productive economic policies. The key point here is that economic policies really depend on the interest of political elites. We're going to come back to that point in a moment. And so in terms of the type of economic policies that promote growth, over the long run, well-known quote from Adam Smith, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice." Now to this we might add something like the existence of infrastructure. It's difficult to do any business if you haven't got any roads. In the DR Congo, this is a state the size of Eastern Europe, they have something like 300 miles of paved roads over the entire country. Immensely difficult to operate any type of business. We might add that. We might also add, in general, property rights, the belief that whatever you produce is not going to be arbitrarily taken from you. But so there's a fairly stable consensus amongst economists and historians about what makes for good policy. And the question is really, how do we get this to align with the interest of political elites? And so fortunately, in political science, we do know a good deal about how this happens. And so one thing to say is that political change tends to be incremental and experimental. So the way that elites perceive their interests might shift slowly over time. It also tends to be domestic. Another important example here was in the 80s and the 90s. Many African countries were going through massive economic crises, and they turned to organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, for assistance. And they made the resultant loans and grants that they were given conditional on policy change, essentially on implementing better economic policies. Not terribly surprisingly, that conditionality completely failed. Most countries implemented almost none of the reforms that they were supposed to do, partly because it didn't really match up with the interests of the people who held power. It would have taken away their control over their economies. Again, for this reason. The other point, though, is that the interests of political elites aren't fixed, that ordinary people can also play a role in shifting their interests and shifting what's seen as politically feasible. And so this is something that I'm going to come back to in thinking through, again, the role that effective altruists elsewhere can play. So we'll think a bit about sort of the levers that drive policy change and how different groups might exercise them. Unfortunately, my My symbols here have been lost. You can imagine those little green boxes are little check marks. But so most obviously, in terms of elites who are almost certain to have policies sort of follow their own interests, this is Aliko Dangote, who's the richest man in Africa, the richest man in Nigeria. You can imagine he phones up the government; they pick up every single time. He has money, he has connections, he knows who runs the show, and critically, he has citizenship rights. The government can't simply ignore what he says. A similar group would be domestic activists. So this is a photo of student activists in South Africa protesting the cost of university education earlier this year. And so if my check marks were here, what they would show is that often these are groups who haven't got a great deal of money, but they have connections to the government, to the state. And again, they have citizenship rights. They can make it very difficult for governments to continue functioning normally. The government often has to pay attention to them. In fact, it was really student activists who drove a huge wave of democratization across Africa in the early 90s, precisely by protesting in this way and essentially making it impossible for elites to ignore their demands for democracy. And for that matter, for economic liberalization, for better economic policy more generally. Then we have, of course, the favorites of the effective altruist movement, my own favorite charity, GiveDirectly, or you could see this as a stand-in for international financial institutions like the World Bank more broadly. So essentially, foreign funders, foreign NGOs, who often have plenty of access to funding. The connections that they have might be a bit more tenuous. It's fairly, it's a bit of a truism that NGOs often don't know what's going on politically in a given country. Most critically, though, they and their donors, people like us possibly, haven't got citizenship rights. They're not people that the government is obliged to listen to. And then finally, again, people like us. What can we contribute to this? We may very well be able to round up decent amounts of money on our own, but unless people have, are part of a diaspora, have family connections to a low-income country, which some of us may, some of us don't. Personally, I haven't. We may lack connections to low-income countries and certainly lack citizenship. And so what I would argue here is that in terms of influencing the levers of policy, one of the roles that effective altruists can play is basically supporting the group that has two of the three key levers, connections and citizenship, but lacks money, that is domestic activists. And not just them, but also journalists, policymakers, and scholars. And so the key point here is that these are groups within low-income countries who can do really two things. So one is that on a more technocratic way, they can essentially develop new bodies of knowledge about the types of economic policies that are appropriate for a given country. They can communicate that to policymakers, build consensus around new types of policy. And then also, as we've seen with student activists, they can essentially change the political calculus of elites to say, we will make your life very difficult if you don't pursue the change that we want. And so in terms of thinking through sort of the levers of how we get from sort of technocratic knowledge about the marginal benefits of a certain policy to policy implementation, this is one of the major channels through which this happens. And I think it actually fits in surprisingly well with the goals of effective altruists. And so thinking about, for example, the question of scale, is this something that's worth doing on a large scale? The question of tractability, is it something that we can make happen with a concerted effort? Is it neglected? And I would say the answer to all three of these is absolutely yes. So the question of scale, why we ought to care about policy reform. So this is a well-known quote from a development economist. The consequences for human welfare involved in questions like these, questions of economic policy reform, are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it's hard to think about anything else. Economic growth is the tool that has pulled everyone who is currently out of poverty, everyone ever who is out of poverty. Economic growth has done it. And so this is why this question is immensely important. Then there's the question of tractability. Can a small group of people make a difference? And again, I would absolutely say yes. So this is an example, to take the example specifically of university funding. So Ashesi University is currently one of the best universities in Ghana. It was founded only a little over 15 years ago by a Ghanaian-American software engineer who went back to Ghana and essentially saw that there were some good state universities, but there was definitely a gap, particularly around technology, engineering, business education. And so with some friends, he rounded up funding. He got support from organizations like the Skoll Foundation. 15 years later, one of the best universities in Ghana. So absolutely something that can be where you can make a significant difference with a relatively small initial investment. Finally, neglectedness. This map is a bit old, but I imagine if you updated it, it wouldn't look terribly different. As you can see, the amount of spending on tertiary education in many low-income areas, certainly in Africa, virtually non-existent. I learned recently that in Sierra Leone, which is recovering from civil war, one of their flagship universities has a student-to-teacher ratio of 1,000 to 1. 8,000 students and 8 faculty members. And so thinking about the marginal effect of even small amounts of funding could be quite significant. And so I think the major point that I want to make here is that there is absolutely a role within effective altruism for what people in development sometimes call thinking and working politically, thinking about the political process by which knowledge about economic policy gets translated into action, because that's the only way it has ever happened. And I think there's absolutely a role that ordinary effective altruists can play in that. Thank you very much. And we've got some time, so I'm happy to take questions. I will go around. So yes, please.
So in terms of funding students, do you think the best way to fund kind of student activist movements is just by funding educational institutions and sort of creating happier students, or is it more by like directly funding domestic activist groups? And how would you go about, if it's the latter, how would you go about selecting domestic activist groups to fund?
I think that in general, the best pathway for that is probably going to be funding higher education more broadly, specifically because that is sort of the role of education and sort of introducing people to different feasible policy universes, we might say, is really important. And partly because it's, for example, going back to the example of a specific protest movement, they're often rather organic, so it's often a bit difficult to sort of like pick a specific movement and fund it. But in general, sort of giving people the capacity both to engage with different ideas of how society might be, but also specifically to do things like giving them stipends for education, or something, or essentially things that sort of give them the financial room to kind of to take up activism, can be incredibly important for things like that. So yeah, great question. Yeah.
She asked my question.
Great. Yes, please.
Given the example of South Korea, what sort of things would you say made it such that their elites were very much in favor of rapid development as opposed to other places? And is like sponsoring students, what other things are there that are in the just need money category other than funding students within a country that seem to push that way?
That's a fantastic question. So I can answer the South Korean example actually mostly by analogy with Rwanda, which is a country that I know a bit more about, having spent time there. But so in both cases, so Rwanda, just brief recent history update. So obviously, severe civil war and genocide in the 90s. After that, they've come out of it with what we would call a stable political settlement. So there has been the same government in place since '94. They have a very strong hold on authority, and they've been doing something very similar to what South Korea has done, or something structurally similar to what you saw in South Korea, which was that essentially you had a strong dictatorship, that because it had a strong hold on power, really wanted to sort of build up, to build up an industrial base, and thus made the requisite investments mostly through state-owned companies so that the profits from those companies went back to the government. So they're different, and so that's obviously a case where, sort of economic growth was aligned with the incentive of elites. That's not quite the case, and this is a great question, because that's not quite the set of cases that I'm talking about. I'm thinking a bit more about cases where elites, you have a good amount of political stability, which I think applies to many low-income countries, but elites aren't quite at the point of wanting to put in, beneficial economic policies yet. And so that's the case where I think that domestic activism has a much larger role to play. Again, kind of in the sense of like if interests are not already aligned there, the way that domestic activism can change that underlying political calculus. That was the first part of your question. Could you remind me what the second part was?
I mean, it feels like you got it both parts. So
Okay.
I guess the other part is basically like what other groups basically just need money to start making changes, but it still seems to be the case that we think that going after like people who are in the country just without money who can apply pressure would be the way to nudge the elites who control things.
I think that's definitely true. I think you could also point to, for example, journalists. I mean, people talk about, I think it's common to sometimes say that the idea of media freedom is sort of it's a Western import. Is this really necessary? It is absolutely necessary, precisely because it keeps elites accountable. And so that's something where simply, funding journalists, offering training, things like that can have a huge beneficial impact on essentially changing the calculus. Can I get away with ripping off the state enterprise? Can I get away with allocating all this land to my family? Something like that. Yeah, great question. Yes, please.
So you said something interesting, which is that, in Rwanda and kind of in South Korea, some of the change is driven by a kind of strong and stable dictatorship model. But then you also referenced earlier the case of the Congo, where a very centralized power structure had led to very different outcomes around self-enrichment. So kind of the two-part question, one of which is what do you think differentiates those cases? I think that especially we in the U.S. have a very general negative view of centralized dictatorial power, and this seems like a more complicated dynamic. And then the second part is do you think that it is only beneficial to focus these kinds of efforts on places that are democratic models, or do you think activism can have a role in less democratic political systems?
Yeah, brilliant questions. So the general question of the question of authoritarian growth is one that economists have been chewing over for some time. In general, the evidence supports sort of these two examples that I discussed, that there's really high variability. Some authoritarian regimes do really well, others do really poorly. In general, they seem to be worse for growth than democratic regimes. But my argument would be that it's not really about whether you're an authoritarian state or a democracy. It's more about, again, the underlying rules of the game. So if you look at places that have grown pretty rapidly, so actually Ghana is a good counterexample. So Ghana has they've had no civil wars. They're one of the best established democracies in Africa. They've been pretty fully democratic for about 25 years now, which is a pretty solid run of democracy. And they've been growing, and they've been growing pretty well, putting in place beneficial reforms and so forth. Over about the same time, Rwanda doing the same thing. My argument would be that in both cases, for slightly different reasons, we've just they've all come to accept that in Ghana, it's just accepted. You get 4 years in the presidency and then you're out, and they know that, and no one's contesting it. But also, no one's trying to steal everything they can while they're in office, because they can always come back in later. In Rwanda, it's a bit different because it is a dictatorship, and so they don't need to steal everything they can right now because they know that they're still going to be there in a while. So it's sort of a question more of underlying stability. I think that by the time countries sort of get to democracy, that's often through a very slow process of sort of building stability slowly, building consensus around the ideas of democratic transitions. So you've sort of already built up to that. Whereas in authoritarian regimes, you have much greater variance. Some of them are sort of strong and stable. Many of them are sort of weak. People are just trying to hold on to power. So it's not so much the regime type, but it's more about the underlying rules of the game. Yes, please.
So how do you think about the possibility of stigma for recipients of money from the U.S. or other Western countries, and sort of how how to identify activists, journalists, and so forth who are going to actually be helped rather than just having their sort of credibility hurt by the association?
It's a fantastic question. And yeah, it's a really significant one. I mean, if there is a strong negative stigma to receiving outside aid, then there's not that much you can do to work around it, unfortunately. But one opportunity might be, for example, instead of providing funding, to provide other types of support, such as, training, something like that. But it's a great question, and there's not really an obvious way to solve that particular challenge. Any other questions? Everyone just want to go coffee? Yes.
This is more of a comment, but
Sure.
it's just relevant to what you were saying. I think it's in the book, The Bottom Billion, we talk about different mechanisms by which governments can perform well, and they had this index of checks and balances with which, if you had the majority of these checks and balances, then a democracy would outperform a third world dictatorship. But if you did not have a significant portion of these checks and balances, oftentimes the dictators would outcompete simply because they had long-term stable power assured to them. They know, I'm going to have power for the rest of my life. Whereas if you're in this sequence of, I need to get all the votes for next year and all the votes for the year after that, you're sort of incentivized to basically try to bribe votes out of the few demographics you need to win, rather than satisfying everyone's longer-term interests.
Yeah, no, that's a commonly made argument as well, and it doesn't. Essentially, if anyone ever asks you if democracy or dictatorship is better for growth, just tell them that it is you have no idea, and it's a stupid question, and they should be asking other questions because it's very difficult to sort it out. It does depend on a great number of things. But yeah, great point.
So the book is called The Bottom Billion. The index is someone else. I have no idea what that index was.
Yeah, the book is by Paul Collier, who's an economist at Oxford.
But one of the things that stuck out was having competitive contracts for government projects is a huge thing at improving outcomes, because otherwise the governments will just give money to their friends to do contracts and things never happen. But if you force competitive contracts, then they actually have to do work.
Yeah, great comment. Thank you. Yes, please.
You had that slide with the the poverty rates and then what is your map against? Is it the GDP or just the richness rate?
Oh, this is this one.
Just 5 more minutes for Q&A, and then we'll have a 5-minute break and switch to the next talk rounds.
So is that, do you think it implies that poverty rates can only actually change with economical growth? Because as sort of a different perspective, usually economic growth contributes to more global pollution too. So is it implied that you will have to have economic growth to lower the poverty rates, or is it what other ways do you see to lower the poverty rates besides just growth?
Growth is all there is. I mean, just mechanically, people are poor because they haven't got enough money, and so the way you fix that is to essentially bring more money into your economy, and that and so, for example, for all of these cases, this is driven by economic growth. That said, I'm actually a bit of a climate. I'm not entirely a climate optimist, because obviously we've just gone so far down the path of climate change, it's difficult to come back. I am an optimist specifically in the sense that, as economists would say, the idea that there's the idea that a clean environment is a normal good. So in other words, that as people get richer, they want more of it. And specifically, as countries get richer, they have more money, more technological capacity, and often more political will to tackle issues of pollution. And so I think there's, and so I think to a really large degree, I see that as much more a question of political will. I don't think it's inherently the case that growth has to be driven, particularly by, by really carbon-producing industries. But that, we have the technology to deal with many of these problems, but it's really a question, A, of funding it, for countries that are still currently growing, and B, of simply kind of making the political commitment to do so.
The producers don't always take the full burden of the pollution. So I mean, is there really like an incentive to like be cleaner when you're
Oh, got it.
economically?
In the sense that like economic growth in the US then has negative externalities for, say, farmers in Africa who suffer from climate change, or I'm not
yeah,
full-
I mean, and even like, you know, people in Africa that are trying to like have economic growth, like, you know, as they grow, you know, they're also going to be producing pollution. It's like, one, it also raises the question of like, you know, we're like, America sort of like, a lot of people argue like America has got to the point where it has gone to, because like we've been allowed to like pollute whatever, you know, so it's like, do we like hinder these countries for polluting, or like, do we let them get to like the same sort of like plane we're on?
Oh, okay, I totally take your point. I don't think that, I think morally saying that we ought to restrict growth for the sake of avoiding pollution, I don't think it holds up. But partly I also think that, I mean, again, just looking at technological change, you know, since, I mean, if you look at the period when we were, and I'll close with this comment so people can get to their next panels, but I mean, if you look at the period when, you know, major economic growth was happening in the US, I mean, this was the age of coal, right? I mean, incredibly inefficient. And so partly, if you look at the dropping cost of things like solar technologies, there are a number of African countries today where the majority of their electricity comes from solar energy already. I mean, you know, if you've been there, it is really, really sunny. Like, it is the perfect place for this. And so I think as well that, I do take your point. I think that there's a moral imperative to raise people's standards of living, but I also think that it's not, I don't think that that inevitably has to entail huge levels of pollution, both for technological reasons, but also for sort of, you know, general, there are other solutions that we could adopt, but have not done so previously. But it's a great question. Thank you so much, everyone.